The first cold of the season always changed the sound of the mountains. The wind sharpened, the pines stiffened, and every cabin in the Wyoming high country began to creak under the weight of early frost. But on the night of October 3rd, 1883, one cabin sounded different. While others groaned like old beasts bracing for winter, this one breathed soft, warm, whispering heat through its log seams, as if the fire inside had never gone out. Inside that cabin sat a man named Elias Norberg, sharpening a draw knife by lantern light. Snow was drifting sideways outside his window, collecting in the corners of the sill. Yet Elias worked with his coat undone sleeves rolled up the room around him, carrying a gentle warmth that felt impossible for a night this early in the season. The fire in his stove had gone cold nearly 6 hours ago, and still the cabin held its warmth like a living thing. Visitors would later swear it made no sense. Heat doesn't stay, they said. Heat runs, and in most cabins it did, slipping through gaps, rising up chimneys, vanishing before dawn. But Elias's home didn't lose heat the way frontier cabins were expected to. Instead, it held on to it. It kept it. It stored it. And the reason sat quietly behind him, a thick, unpainted interior wall stretching from floor to rafters. A wall his neighbors joked about for months, calling it Elias's stupid wall. Too thick, too heavy, too strange. Why would any sane man waste half a season building a wall twice as wide as it needed to be? But Elias never argued. He simply nodded, lifted another stone, and kept building. What no one understood, not yet, was that this wall was not a wall at all. It was a machine, a silent one, a tool crafted from forgotten knowledge and frontier necessity. A heat battery disguised as rough stone and clay mortar, and on this icy October night, while every cabin for 10 miles shivered, this one stayed warm. Warm because of a trick everyone mocked. Warm because one man understood what the others didn't. Warm because of a wall that should not have worked, but did. When Elias Norberg first arrived in the Powder River country, most folks agreed he seemed like a sensible enough man. Quiet, broad-shouldered, steady-handed, the sort of fellow who could fell timber clean or mend a wagon wheel without talking about it afterward. But all of that changed the day he began stacking stones inside his half-finished cabin. It started in late July, when the sun was still strong, and the scent of pine pitch hung thick in the air. Elias had just finished raising the main walls of his one-room home when he paused, walked to the north side, and began marking a rectangle on the floorboards. Neighbors passing by assumed he was planning a pantry or tool alcove. But the next morning, they found him hauling in river stones by the armload, piling them neatly in the corner. By noon, he had built a low trough of timber against the inner north wall and had begun dry-fitting stones inside it one by one, as if arranging pieces of a puzzle only he could see. Word traveled quickly. Settlers wandering by slowed their horses to stare. A few dismounted to poke at the growing stone structure with their boot toes. Most laughed. Why in God's name would a man waste precious summer hours stacking rocks inside his cabin? Building a fortress in there, Elias, someone called. Looks like he's walling himself in, another joked. But the sharpest critic was Samuel Dobbins, a rancher who took pride in never missing a chance to share his opinion. "You know heat rises, don't you?" he scoffed, leaning against the doorframe as Elias worked. "A wall won't warm a cabin. A wall can't hold heat. You're fixin' to freeze yourself come December." Elias didn't look up. He simply set another stone, adjusting it with the deliberate patience of a craftsman. "Heat does rise," he said quietly, "but it also stays where you put it, if you give it mass." The men exchanged glances, the kind frontier neighbors shared when deciding whether someone had lost their mind or was simply foreign enough to believe strange things. Still, Elias kept working. The laughter didn't bother him. He had spent too many years standing beside furnaces to doubt what stone could do. And as he lifted the next river rock into place, he felt the familiar weight of skepticism settling onto his shoulders. It wouldn't be the last time. Most men on the frontier understood fire. They knew how to split kindling feed a stove or bank embers beneath ash. But very few understood heat. Elias Norberg was one of the rare exceptions, not because he was smarter, he'd insist, but because he'd spent half a lifetime standing close enough to molten iron to feel the truth in his bones. Back in Minnesota, before the West called to him, Elias had worked in a small foundry where furnaces roared from dawn till dusk. There he learned lessons no book could teach. He learned how stone softens when exposed to enough heat. He learned how a brick wall beside a forge could stay warm long after the fire died. And he learned that heat like water could be stored not in the air, which slips away like a thief, but in mass, in solid, dense material that refuses to let go of what's poured into it. To the men of Wyoming territory, thermal mass meant nothing. It wasn't a term, an idea, or a concept worth noticing. But to Elias, it was the key to surviving the brutal winters he had heard described in letters and trading post gossip. A fire gave warmth, yes, but stones kept it. Clay kept it. Brick kept it. Dense material properly heated could act like a battery long before anyone had heard the word. So when neighbors mocked his growing stone wall, Elias simply nodded. He didn't need to convince them. He'd already seen mass work its miracles. In the foundry, the furnace walls glowed softly, even hours after the last ore bucket was hauled away. During winter, workers would warm their hands by stone that hadn't seen flame since morning. And he remembered clear as if it were yesterday, the old Swedish mason who once told him, "Air forgets heat." Stone remembers. That memory took root in him. And later, standing alone on the Wyoming frontier, he trusted it more than he trusted the opinions of a dozen men who only knew fire as something to chase away the night. Elias understood a principle older than frontier cabins, older than the Rockies themselves. Mass holds heat because it has nowhere else to go. And while his neighbors built taller chimneys and bigger fireplaces, Elias built something completely different, and something the land itself had already proven was true. Most men who heard what Elias was doing assumed he was building some odd version of an underfloor heater. After all, the only stories of heat-holding structures they knew came from old tales of Scandinavian stone beds or masonry hearths. But Elias never once looked at the floor. He kept returning to the north wall, the coldest surface of any frontier cabin, the one spot every homesteader feared when winter tightened its grip. It wasn't by accident. During his first month on the claim, Elias lived in a simple canvas tent pitched beside the cabin frame. Each night, he watched the wind sweep down from the Bighorn Mountains, striking the northern face of his half-finished home like a hammer. Frost formed earliest there. Ice lingered longest. Even in August, the inside of the logs felt cool to the touch. If heat escaped anywhere, he realized it would be there. But something else influenced his decision, something more personal. In Minnesota, he had helped rebuild a fire-damaged workshop where the stone chimney had cracked and fallen inward. When the rubble was cleared, Elias discovered that the stones closest to the original flue were still warm after nearly a full day, without fire. Not glowing, not hot, but holding a gentle memory of heat, long after the timber around them had turned brittle and cold. It fascinated him. Why did vertical mass hold warmth longer than expected? He carried that question into Wyoming. The floor of a frontier cabin was vulnerable. Rodents ground moisture, shifting frost heaved the constant threat of rot. Building a massive stone chamber beneath it would have required more labor and risk than a lone homesteader could afford. But a wall raised deliberately, thickened by design, could be both structure and storage. A dual-purpose solution. So Elias made his choice. He framed a second inner wall parallel to the northern log line, leaving an 18-inch cavity between them. He lined that cavity with fire brick, stolen from the ruins of an abandoned stage station. Then, stone by stone, he began filling the void, creating a hidden mass that could soak up heat and bleed it back into the room through the long winter nights. Neighbors wondered why he didn't simply build a bigger stove. But Elias didn't want bigger flame. He wanted lasting warmth. And he knew the north wall was the place to store it. By late August, Elias's cabin looked less like a home and more like a blacksmith's experiment gone wrong. The north wall, double-framed and half-filled, rose like a blunt pillar of stubborn stone. Visitors stepped inside, stared at the growing mass, and walked back out, shaking their heads. The frontier had seen its share of eccentric projects, but this one stretched to the imagination. It was heavy. It was strange. And above all, it was ugly. But to Elias, it was beautiful. The work began with the foundation trench. He dug it by hand, shaping a long, narrow channel directly along the inner wall line. Every scoop of earth had to be leveled, tamped, and checked with a carpenter's square. If the wall wasn't perfectly vertical, it wouldn't store heat evenly. And worse, it could collapse under its own weight. Next came the fire channel, the part that confused his neighbors more than anything else. Instead of building a broad hearth or a simple chimney, Elias constructed a narrow brick duct that entered the wall from the outside. This heat throat, as he quietly called it, would guide hot air upward through the stone mass before releasing the exhausted warmth into a flue hidden near the rafters. He knew the materials mattered. So he scavenged abandoned telegraph posts for clay-rich soil, sifted it through his fingers, and mixed it with river sand to form mortar strong enough to withstand cycling heat. Every brick was placed with the care of a man who understood failure meant rebuilding the entire structure. Then came the stones. Granite and basalt, dense, stubborn, unforgiving stones that weighed as much as anvils. Day after day, Elias hauled them from the creek, sometimes dragging them on a makeshift sled, sometimes carrying them in a leather sling across his back. Each stone was inspected, tapped, and cleaned. Stones with hidden cracks were tossed aside. Wet stones were left in the sun until bone dry. He layered them tightly, binding their irregular shapes into a single cohesive mass. As the wall rose, so did the gossip. "Looks like a tombstone for a giant," someone muttered. "More like a chimney," he forgot to finish, another added. But Elias kept stacking, patient as winter itself. By early September, the wall stood shoulder high, solid, ugly, immovable, exactly as he intended. The first true test arrived earlier than anyone expected. On the evening of October 2nd, a blue norther swept across the high plains, carrying with it a bitter wind that scraped frost onto every window pane, from the Bighorns to the Platte. By sundown, settlers were stacking wood by their stoves, muttering about winter coming too soon. And in the middle of it all, Elias Norberg prepared his strange wall for its maiden run. He stepped outside into the sharp air breath clouding and knelt beside the firebox he'd built against the cabin's exterior. It was a small thing, just a brick chamber with a cast-iron door and a slanted grate. Yet it had taken him nearly 2 weeks to perfect. Tonight would prove whether all of it had been worth the labor. Inside the firebox, he stacked seasoned pine with the care of a man laying foundation stones. Smaller splits first, then larger logs, each angled to encourage a strong upward draft into the hidden channel behind the wall. When he struck the match, the fire caught instantly, a bright flare illuminating his frost-rimmed beard. By the time night settled fully, the firebox roared. Heat surged through the brick duct rising behind the wall, bleeding into the stones that had waited months for this moment. Elias placed a hand against the interior surface. At first, it felt merely warm. Then warmer. Then unmistakably hot, radiating like the side of a masonry oven. He tended the fire for 3 hours, feeding it steadily, until the outer air dropped into the 20s and frost began to crawl across the porch boards. Inside the cabin glowed with a gentle, even warmth, the kind one feels in the heart of a sun-heated barn on a winter morning. At 10 p.m., he let the fire die. The last of the embers settled with a sigh. Now came the question that had hovered over him for months. Would the stones remember the heat? Would the wall continue giving warmth long after the flames were nothing but ash? He sat in the quiet cabin lantern, dim, listening, feeling, waiting. Outside, wind clawed at the eaves. Inside, the wall breathed warmth. The first freeze had come, and Elias's invention had finally awakened. Word travels quickly across open country, especially when something strange is involved. By the next morning, half the valley already knew Elias had lit his wall on fire, as one man put it. So when John Mercer, a former pharmacist from Boston, turned homesteader, rode up that afternoon with a leather satchel and a skeptical grin, Elias knew exactly why he'd come. Mercer stepped inside the cabin, pulled off his gloves, and raised his eyebrows. "Feels warmer than it ought to," he admitted. "Your stove running?" "No fire since last night," Elias replied. Mercer snorted. "Impossible." He opened his satchel and produced a brass and glass thermometer, one of the few precision instruments within 50 miles.
It's working perfectly.
In Boston, he had used it to measure tinctures and medicinal compounds. Out here, it mostly served to settle arguments. "Let's see what your magic wall says," Mercer muttered. Elias said nothing. He simply stepped aside. Mercer placed the thermometer's bulb against the interior surface of the stone wall. His expression shifted almost immediately. First, curiosity, then confusion, then a faint flicker of disbelief. He held it there longer, watching the red column rise. 132 degrees, he whispered. "And you haven't burned a stick since last night." "No," Elias said. "The stones hold warmth." Mercer moved to the center of the room, stood still, and inhaled.
All right, let's get this out of here.
Air's around 67. Without fire. In October.
Almost done.
He paced slowly, as if trying to uncover some hidden stove or trick panel. A wall shouldn't do this. Wood stoves can't do this. Even masonry fireplaces lose heat in a few hours. Elias finally spoke. Heat leaves air quickly, but not stone. Stone stores it deep inside and releases it when the air grows cold. Mercer frowned at the thermometer again, shaking his head. "Back in Boston, we had a boiler room lined with brick. Stayed warm half the night after shutting down. But nothing like this." He tapped the glass thoughtfully. "Your neighbors won't believe these numbers." "They don't need to," Elias replied. "Winter will tell them." Mercer slipped the thermometer back into its case, eyes narrowed with new respect. "You may be onto something, Elias. Something folks out here aren't ready to understand." Outside, frost glimmered in the afternoon sun. Inside, the wall was still warm, and the skeptics were running out of arguments. As the days grew shorter and the nights sharpened into early winter cold, the settlers around Powder River kept searching for explanations. Mercer's measurements had silenced a few voices, but most still clung to the belief that Elias's warm cabin was some kind of fluke, a lucky wind pattern, a hidden stove, or sheer frontier superstition. Because in their minds, nothing could outperform a good fireplace. Nothing. But fireplaces, Elias knew, had a fatal flaw baked into their design. One evening, a small group of neighbors gathered inside his cabin, stamping snow from their boots and crowding close to the strange north wall. They were polite enough not to laugh outright, but their expressions made their thoughts clear. "Show us the trick." Elias didn't argue. He walked to their own fireplaces first. "You build these tall," he said, "and wide. Looks good. Feels good. But most of the heat," he pointed upward, "goes there." Up the chimney, Dobbins scoffed. "That's how a fireplace works." "Yes," Elias replied calmly. "That is why the heat leaves." He knelt by Dobbins' fireplace and drew a line in the ash with his finger. "Air is light, Air cannot hold heat. It warms quickly, then escapes quickly. Your fire makes hot air. The hot air rises. That heat is gone in minutes. Then he placed his palm against his own stone wall. Even after hours without flame, warmth pulsed from it, steady, gentle, unhurried. But stone, Elias said, is heavy, dense, full of places for heat to hide. Heat moves into it slowly, stays there long, comes back out slowly. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Heat rising is not the problem, Elias continued. Losing heat is, and your fireplaces lose most of it before you feel it. He described what he had seen in foundries' furnace walls, glowing long after the fire stopped, brick chimneys radiating warmth until morning, the strange patience of thermal mass. But what truly caught his neighbor's attention was the comparison. With your fireplace, Elias said, you burn wood for 8 hours, for 4 hours of comfort. With this wall, I burn for 4 hours, for 16 hours of comfort. Silence followed, not because they fully understood, but because the numbers made more sense than anything else had. Elias didn't need them to believe the theory. The winter air outside would prove the truth soon enough. By mid-December, winter no longer crept across the valley, it ruled it. The Powder River region turned into a white anvil hammered day and night by wind sharp enough to peel bark off dead cottonwoods. Snowdrifts grew taller than a man, and every footstep outside cracked like breaking glass. This was the kind of cold that exposed weaknesses, weak roofs, weak joints, weak men, and weak heating systems. Cabins that had seemed snug in October were now leaking heat like sieves. Every night, lantern light revealed breath, turning to fog inside living rooms. Children slept wrapped in buffalo robes. Men woke 3, sometimes 4 times before dawn to feed their fireplaces. The valley became a chorus of midnight axe strokes and groaning hinges as homesteaders stumbled outside to fetch more wood. But in one cabin, the routine was different. Every afternoon, usually around 2, Elias stepped outside, brushed snow from the firebox door, and lit a fresh load of pine. The fire burned hard for 3.5 hours, sending its heat coursing through the hidden throat behind the wall. By early evening, the wall radiated a slow, steady warmth that filled the cabin like stored summer. Then Elias let the fire die. At first, neighbors thought he'd given up. Perhaps he'd run out of wood or miscalculated his strange design. But then rumors spread. Smoke no longer rose from Elias's chimney at night. Yet his lantern glowed steadily through the window. He wasn't huddled under blankets. He wasn't adding wood at midnight. He wasn't waking before dawn with frozen fingers. He was sleeping, a luxury the frontier rarely allowed. One night, during a brutal cold snap that dragged temperatures down to 20 below, Mercer rode over to check on him. He expected to find Elias half frozen or scrambling to relight a fire. Instead, he stepped into a room glowing with warmth. The air held steady around 54 degrees, not balmy, but comfortable enough to take off gloves. The stone wall hummed with deep, radiant heat, a silent furnace still working nearly 16 hours after the last flame had died. Mercer lifted his lantern awe, settling onto his face. Good Lord, Elias. Your wall's doing the work of 3 men. Elias simply smiled. Winter had delivered the verdict his neighbors never would. By January, the difference between Elias and his neighbors could be measured not only in degrees of warmth, but in piles of firewood, or more accurately, in how quickly those piles disappeared. Life on the frontier was a ledger of labor. Every hour spent cutting, hauling, drying, and stacking wood was an hour stolen from trapping, mending fences, tending animals, or simply resting. On the high plains, time was as valuable as food, and Elias suddenly had more of it than anyone else. Most settlers in the valley burned through 3 to 5 cords of wood per month in deep winter. The cold forced them into a vicious cycle: burn wood to stay warm, then cut more wood to replace what they burned. Dobbins, the loudest critic of Elias's wall, spent entire days trudging through drifts to fell green timber he wouldn't even have time to season. Others rationed wood by letting fires die during the night, only to wake to cabins so cold their boots stiffened like iron. Elias, meanwhile, burned just over 1 cord per month, barely a third of what his neighbors needed, because he wasn't heating air. He was heating stone, and stone was far more loyal. Every afternoon, he fed the firebox 20 or 30 pounds of pine, usually less than he could carry in a single trip. The fire ran hot for 4 hours, soaking into the wall's dense core. Then the wall took over, releasing heat calmly and evenly throughout the night. Elias spent maybe 20 minutes a day cutting or hauling wood. His neighbors spent 2 to 3 hours doing the same. Those missing hours mattered. While others returned home exhausted, Elias found time to repair tools, work leather, or mend snowshoes. He hunted more often, trapped more steadily, and kept better care of his livestock. In a land where survival was an equation, he had discovered a multiplier. And the neighbors noticed. When they rode past his homestead and saw his modest woodpile hardly shrinking, they didn't laugh anymore. Some grew uneasy. Others grew envious. Winter revealed truths that summer gossip couldn't hide. Elias wasn't just warmer. He was richer in time, richer in labor, richer in energy, simply because he understood how heat wanted to live inside stone. By February, the valley had stopped mocking Elias and started studying him. What had begun as a curiosity and then a joke had become a point of stubborn pride for many settlers. Frontier men were not fond of being shown up, especially by a quiet Scandinavian who built a wall that somehow outperformed every fireplace in Wyoming territory. So they tried to copy him, and the failures arrived almost immediately. The first attempt came from Calvin Yates, a young ranch hand convinced he could improve on Elias's design by working smarter, not harder, as he put it. Instead of hauling dense river stones, Yates filled the space between his cabin wall and a makeshift inner frame with soft limestone chunks he collected from a nearby ridge. They were light, easy to carry, and seemed to pack tightly. The first time he lit a fire behind the wall, half the stones cracked with sharp, snapping sounds. By morning, the wall cavity was filled with crumbled white powder and hairline fractures. Limestone, Elias gently reminded him, holds moisture and cannot survive repeated thermal stress. Yates didn't find the reminder gentle at all. The second attempt belonged to Jonas Rell, who refused to believe depth mattered. "A wall's a wall," he said, cutting the cavity to just 6 inches thick, barely enough space to hold a decent layer of stone. His wall warmed quickly, stayed warm briefly, then cooled to nothing before midnight. The next morning, frost coated the inside of his cabin windows. Jonas declared the entire concept overrated nonsense and returned to burning wood like a steam engine. But the most instructive failure came from older settler Bernard Price, who tried building his version using adobe bricks instead of stone. Adobe was familiar, easier to work with, and plentiful in the area. But moisture crept into the bricks, and when the first hard freeze hit, the trapped water expanded, bursting the bricks one by one. By December, his entire wall had collapsed inward, like a sandcastle struck by a rogue tide. Each failure traveled through the valley as quickly as gossip ever had, but with an important pattern. Every failed version had cut corners Elias refused to cut. Wrong stones, wrong thickness, wrong materials, wrong understanding of airflow. Neighbors began to say, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes respectfully, "The wall works, but only if you build it his way." And for the first time, the laughter truly stopped. They weren't doubting the wall anymore. They were doubting themselves. The wall had become a local curiosity long before it became a legend. But no one expected the story to travel beyond the Powder River Valley. Yet frontier news spreads in odd ways, through stage driver supply trains, wandering surveyors, and the occasional traveling salesman who repeats a story simply because it sounds unbelievable. One such tale about a man who heated his home with a stone wall eventually reached the ears of Professor Edmund Halcomb, a geology lecturer from Illinois, visiting the territory to study mineral formations. According to him, he had heard three versions of the story. One claiming Elias heated his cabin with volcanic rock, another insisting he had discovered a new fuel, and a third suggesting he had hidden a boiler inside his log wall. Curiosity overcame schedule. So the professor rode 30 miles out of his way to see the marvel for himself. He appeared unexpectedly one afternoon, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, spectacles fogging in the cold notebook tucked under his arm. He introduced himself the way academics do, formally, slowly, and with an air of someone who expected to be taken seriously. "I hope you don't mind," Halcomb said, stepping inside Elias's cabin. "I've come to measure your wall." Elias nodded, as if professors wandered into homesteads every day. Halcomb began immediately placing thermometers in different parts of the cabin, tapping stones with a small hammer, measuring the wall's thickness with brass calipers. When he inspected the fire channel, he muttered a quiet, ingenious under his breath, though he refused to elaborate. After an hour, he warmed his hands before the radiating wall and asked, "May I burn a fire and conduct a proper test?" Elias agreed. The professor stoked the firebox with the zeal of a scientist deprived of experiments. For 4 hours, he recorded temperature changes every 15 minutes, charting the rise of heat behind the wall and the gradual warming of the cabin air. When the fire finally died, he sat back, eyes narrowed in fascination. "This is a passive masonry heater," he declared, "except you've built it vertically, and with airflow far more efficient than many European designs I've studied." Elias shrugged. "Just a wall that remembers heat." Halcomb smiled, a wide, genuine expression that softened his stern academic demeanor. "No, Mr. Norberg," he said quietly. "It is proof that frontier ingenuity can rival any university laboratory." He stayed 2 nights taking meticulous notes. And when he left, he told Elias, "This wall of yours will be written about someday. I promise you that." By the time spring thaw crept across the valley, Elias's heating wall had earned a quiet respect. No one mocked it anymore. No one questioned whether it worked. They had lived through the coldest winter in a decade, and the proof stood in front of them, like a stone monument: fewer sleepless nights, lower wood piles, and a man who never woke to frozen boots. But frontier memory is short, and the world beyond the mountains moved on even faster. The first blow to Elias's invention came from cast-iron stoves. Railroads brought them in by the dozens, shiny black, factory-made, compact enough to fit in a wagon, powerful enough to heat a small farmhouse. Men liked them. They were modern. They made a home look civilized. Most importantly, you could buy one in a single afternoon rather than spend months gathering stones. Then came coal. When the rail lines expanded north from Cheyenne, coal became cheap and plentiful. A pound of coal burned hotter and longer than a pound of wood, and it didn't demand endless hours of backbreaking labor. Settlers abandoned wood piles for coal scuttles, and the idea of building a massive stone wall became even less appealing. By the 1890s, the frontier was dissolving. Cabins became houses, houses became towns. People wanted wallpaper uniform stoves, straight chimneys, things that matched the lives their parents had left behind in the East. A crude stone heating wall felt like something from another century, and in truth it was. Even those who tried replicating Elias's method often failed. Without his discipline, his insistence on dry stone, correct depth, proper airflow, the walls they built cracked, overheated, or performed poorly. Neighbors concluded the method was flawed, rather than admitting their workmanship had been. The world wanted convenience. The world wanted uniformity. The world wanted fast solutions. And so, an invention that once kept a man warm through 16-hour winter nights faded into obscurity. Not because it didn't work, but because it didn't fit the new rhythm of life. By 1905, only a handful of homes still used stone heating walls. By 1920, fewer still. And by the time Elias was an old man, his once remarkable discovery lived only in memory, slowly smothered by progress. The wall had not failed. The world simply moved on without it. A century after Elias Norberg stacked the last stone into his heating wall, the world finally circled back to ideas it once laughed at. Not because frontier stories resurfaced, but because modern engineers began facing the same old problem. How do you keep a space warm for a long time without wasting fuel? They rediscovered an answer Elias had known in 1883. Today, engineers give it different names: thermal mass passive solar storage, radiant retention systems, but the principle is unchanged heat, something heavy, and it will pay you back slowly, hour after hour, long after the fire's gone. In the 1970s, energy crises pushed designers toward trombe walls, thick masonry walls placed behind south-facing windows, absorbing sunlight during the day and releasing it slowly at night. They looked strikingly familiar. Photographs of early trombe walls, dark stone surfaces glowing faintly with stored heat, might as well have been sketches from Elias's own cabin. Then came masonry heaters widely adopted in Europe. Giant stone stoves that burn a fast, hot fire and hold the heat for up to 24 hours. Their flues snake through tons of brick or soapstone before exiting the chimney, soaking every bit of warmth into the mass. Modern versions are beautiful, sleek, polished, carefully engineered, but the soul of the design is the same. Even more surprisingly, rocket mass heaters, the darling of today's off-grid and homestead communities, mirror the very heart of Elias's wall. A super-hot burn chamber, a long thermal pathway, and a mass of stone or cob that releases heat long after the fire is gone. Videos online show homesteaders warming their hands on cob benches that stay hot until morning. They are, without realizing it, building descendants of a forgotten frontier idea. Architects designing net-zero homes now prioritize thermal storage walls, insulated rock beds, and radiant flooring. Survival experts teach the value of heat banking. Scientists write articles about the efficiency of dense materials numbers that Elias understood instinctively without instruments, simply by spending a lifetime near furnaces. Elias's wall didn't disappear. It reappeared refined, renamed, dressed in modern terminology. The world did not abandon the principle. It only forgot the man who proved it, with nothing but stone fire and stubborn belief. Long after the valley thawed and the stone wall dulled to the color of dry river rock, Elias Norberg found himself thinking less about the winter he survived, and more about the lessons that winter had carved into him. Out on the frontier, survival wasn't just physical. It was philosophical. The land tested your mind as much as your muscles. And his strange heating wall, mocked and doubted for so long, revealed truths far larger than the stones that held it together. The first lesson was simple. Understand the principle, not just the practice. His neighbors knew how to burn wood. They had done it their whole lives. But few stopped to ask where heat traveled, where it vanished, where it hid. They followed tradition without questioning it. Elias, shaped by years in a foundry, understood heat's temperament. He didn't fight it. He worked with it. It wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It was respect for the laws of nature. The second lesson was one every homesteader knew, but few lived by. Details matter. A wall built with the wrong stones failed. A wall too thin cooled too fast. A duct too narrow choked the airflow. Many settlers tried to copy Elias, but they copied only what they saw, not what he understood. Frontier shortcuts, he would later say, are expensive in winter. The third lesson was quieter yet more profound. Courage isn't loud. When a dozen men told him he was wrong, Elias didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply built. Frontier wisdom often grows in silence, in evenings spent alone, listening to the wind, trusting your own hands more than the opinions of others. He learned that a man who waits for approval will freeze before he finishes anything worthwhile. And lastly, the wall taught him something he carried for the rest of his life. Knowledge shared is warmth multiplied. When the neighbors who once mocked him came asking for advice, he didn't turn them away. He explained the stones, the airflow, the depth, the discipline. Not because he wanted credit or payment, but because a warm valley was better than a cold one. Helping others survive was its own reward. In the end, the wall wasn't just a heating system. It was a reminder that on the frontier, wisdom was the most reliable fuel a man could carry. Years rolled across the Wyoming high country like slow-moving storms, reshaping the land and the people who lived on it. Cabins became houses, horses gave way to rail cars, lanterns surrendered to electric bulbs. But even as the world changed around him, Elias Norberg never forgot the winter his wall proved itself, not to the valley, but to him. He lived long enough to see the territory become a state, long enough to watch neighbors move into town, and younger families replace the old log cabins with framed houses and coal stoves. His own stone wall continued to work year after year, unwavering, patient, unchanged by time. When he finally moved to live with his daughter in 1907, the new owners of his homestead tore down parts of the cabin, but left the north wall standing. Too much trouble to remove, they said, and it keeps the place warm. Elias found that amusing. He never built another wall like it. He never patented the idea or wrote instructions for newspapers. He wasn't chasing legacy. For him, the wall had always been a simple answer to a simple need: warmth in a land that offered very little freely. But the lessons lived on. He understood more than most that innovation rarely arrives with fanfare. Often it begins as a quiet thought grows under the weight of ridicule, then stands or falls under the unforgiving test of winter. The world remembers the inventions that changed nations, but it forgets the ones that simply made hard lives easier. His wall belonged to the second kind, the kind built by stubborn hands, shaped by necessity, and proven by cold nights when fire had long gone out. If he had told the story himself, he would have said it plainly: I didn't outsmart winter. I just learned how heat likes to live. Today, modern engineers talk about thermal mass as if it were a discovery of the last century. Homesteaders proudly build rocket mass heaters. Architects design solar storage walls. They think they've found something new. But in truth, they are walking a path. Elias walked alone in 1883, guided not by science degrees or modern formulas, but by observation, patience, and a willingness to trust the quiet wisdom of stone. A wall everyone called stupid kept a man warm through 16-hour nights. A wall built from ridicule became a lesson for the future. And winter, as always, revealed the truth long before people did.